Germans are fond of traveling, and no country seems unreachable. Cruises are especially popular as they have something for everyone, but for a long time many holidaymakers could only afford a trip by train.
By now, we've become very accustomed to the railroad. Often it's simply taken for granted, existing in the background in terms of our daily traffic.
Since the 1920s, the railroad has been the means of mass transportation. In the 50s, the car was its only competitor. At that time, more and more Germans were drawn to the dream country of Italy. Initially, cruises were the privilege of wealthy passengers. Only a few could afford a trip. It was not until the 1980s that this branch of tourism developed into a boom industry.
Up until 2019, we were in a trend where we were traveling more and more, but over shorter and shorter distances.
Since the introduction of the jet, mass tourism has expanded worldwide.
Flying was becoming more popular and people wanted to travel. Mobility was something that could be afforded privately.
Mallorca has been firmly in German hands since the 90s, including Ballermann.
I'm going to need a week's holiday when I get home.
The 20s were the beginning of mass tourism. The most important means of transportation was the railroad. And the prerequisite for this new leisure activity, paid vacation for workers and employees. Steam locomotives like the Adler have been traveling through German lands since 1835. The first route ran from Nuremberg to Fürth.
The real railroad age in Germany began on December 7, 1835, when a steam engine-powered train first made the long distance of 6 kilometers from Nuremberg to Fürth, taking a good quarter of an hour. That was the starting gun for the railroad age in Germany.
It was this invention from England that made the new means of transport possible, a development that was to make the German nation mobile.
Obviously, the railroad made it possible to get from one place to another much faster than before, and very comfortably and relatively cheaply. And this was, of course, for travelers of all kinds, and we're not just talking about tourists either. This new mode of transportation was extremely appealing to everyone.
In Great Britain, as early as 1825, the development of regular passenger rail transport had begun. In the summer of 1841, the resourceful Briton Thomas Cook organized a rail trip from Leicester to Loughborough. The fare included tea, ham sandwiches and a live band.
These excursions or day trips had been done by other people before. It was just that Thomas Cook's excursion in 1841 became famous because, as a strict teetotaler, he wanted to ban alcohol. There was a whole movement around this in England and later in other countries. And so he created this non-alcoholic folk festival on the train from Leicester to Loughborough, which isn't far, 12, 13 miles, I think, and then back again. And that is mistakenly considered the first package tour.
The expansion of the route network enabled the railroad to penetrate even remote regions. As a result, it quickly developed into a means of mass transportation.
The first part of the route expansion in Germany ran until the 1870s and 80s with the building of the main routes, connecting the major centers, the capital cities, the business locations, the important trade hubs. And from the 1880s, the development of secondary lines began, which branched out from larger stations into the region and into the countryside. And through that, the whole country slowly became connected.
At the same time, the railroad became an economic growth engine, allowing a strengthening of a middle class which could now invest its financial resources in travel without an obvious purpose. In other words, tourism.
The railroad was actually the perfect means of transport, the perfect technology to offer package tours with. It made traveling easier and safer, of course, and also from an organizational point of view, whether I traveled somewhere with a horse or by train carriage. With a system like the railroad, one had a completely different level of risk. It had functioned very reliably from the very beginning, and also worked according to a timetable, meaning one could plan those travel times pretty accurately.
In the 19th century, the Rhineland developed into one of the first popular travel destinations in the German Empire. At that time, Karl Baedeker ran a publishing bookshop in Koblenz. His guidebook Rheinreise von Mainz nach Köln became a publishing success story.
He founded his publishing house in Koblenz in the same year that the Prussian Rhine Steamship Company was founded. So there was traffic on the Rhine, and there were relatively many tourists on the way. He would have noted that, and he would also have noted that there were quite a lot of Englishmen around from 1835-36, and many of them had one of those famous red books by John Murray with them, an English travel guide. He probably looked at those books very closely and then later adopted the red covers for which the Baedeker is so famous today.
The Baedeker travel guide became the standard and allowed travelers more independence and security. The costs and risks of a trip became calculable.
The emerging travel guides channeled a lot of travelers. So if there was a Baedeker that showed a very specific region, then it actually happened that the tourists also checked off exactly that region. That is, walked through exactly the places that were in the Baedeker.
From 1840 to 1910, the length of railroad lines in the German Reich grew from 500 to 63,000 kilometers, and passenger numbers exploded.
The
railroad now enabled more and more people to get somewhere very cheaply. And at that moment, what you might call mass tourism started to emerge. However, this was still limited to a small elite within the empire. I calculated that it was about 10% up until World War I, so around 1914, who travelled annually. And this practice of travelling every year, the vacation trip, that indeed changed people's lives very much.
The beaches on the North Sea and Baltic Sea also became popular holiday destinations for the middle classes during the Wilhelmine Empire. 700,000 people holidayed in those seaside resorts before the First World War. Many white-collar workers and almost all civil servants were entitled to annual leave at that time, still leaving 90% of workers who were not.
The round trip remained at that time still rather reserved for the men. But the stationary trip, the trip to the summer resort, was not as expensive as a spa. That was a matter for the bourgeois family. The bourgeois family, in fact, was actually created because of the holiday.
With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the idea of a pan-Europe of transport, as well as holidaying at home as a patriotic duty, came to an end. Mobilization posed great challenges for the railroads and became a race against time.
At the end of the First World War, these railroads were relatively at rock bottom. The states weren't allowed to sell them either. Also, they were considered part of the reparation pledge by the Allies as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles.
As a result of the lost war, Emperor Wilhelm II had to abdicate. On the 10th of November 1918, he boarded his train at the Dutch border station of Echten and went into exile.
This epoch of bourgeois security simply came to an end. During the First World War, people realized that many of the things they thought were safe were not. And after World War I, people everywhere probably had very different concerns than they do now, such as visiting the Eiffel Tower.
In the Weimar Republic, white-collar workers, civil servants and blue-collar workers replaced the middle classes as the largest group of travelers, with tourism developing into an important factor in the national economy. Lower working hours and paid vacations covered by collective agreements were the prerequisites for this new form of leisure activity.
The great leap, the great development with regard to mass tourism happened in the 1920s because for the first time the possibility was created by the legislature and through the collective agreements that came about in the 1920s that there was a guaranteed holiday for a larger number of people. Before that, civil servants generally had a certain holiday entitlement, and now this holiday entitlement was extended to white-collar workers, and in some cases also to blue-collar workers. And that meant that the mass of the population had been reached as far as holiday entitlement was concerned. And of course, they also wanted to go away. They already went out into the countryside on Sundays, and if you had a few days holiday, you wanted to go further. People had reduced working hours. That was also related to the collective bargaining agreement. The 8-hour day moved in, and that created a whole new way of organizing one's time.
The importance of modern transport advertising was recognized early on by Reichsbahner. Adolf Sarter published a guide. Advertising posters printed in English were intended to improve the German image abroad at the end of the 1920s.
The development of really seeing the traveller as a customer, of discovering the tourist as a factor for making money, took place in the period after the First World War with the German state railways, the Reichsbahn. This was the beginning of the time when intensive advertising was carried out, offering special social trains and special trains in general, on which to travel either independently, part independently, or in conjunction with travel agencies. And that's when you started to notice that the tourist as such had arrived at the railroad.
Zwischen diesen Städten Nürnberg, Bamberg und Bayreuth liegt die Fränkische Schweiz. Sie ist eines der schönsten und zugleich romantischsten Landschaftsgebiete Süddeutschlands und von allen Seiten her mit der Bahn bequem zu erreichen.
One was informed, so to speak, and thereby encouraged to choose this destination. The special thing was that the railroad itself appeared only very little, often only a few minutes. The film about Franconian Switzerland, with a running time of a good hour, shows 3 to 4 minutes of railroad scenes, nothing more, because there was no alternative to the railroad at all. If you wanted to go there, you usually went by train.
Die Fränkische Schweiz ist ein Gebirgsländchen im Kleinen, das seinesgleichen sucht. Weite Höhenzüge, klappernde Mühlen, schattige Wälder.
The state railway played a major role in shaping the growing travel market with its range of services. Passenger travel took on greater importance as a source of income. At the end of the 1920s, lavishly produced advertising films such as Miss Evelyn, Die Badefee, Miss Evelyn, the Bathing Fairy, were intended to arouse the Germans' desire to travel. The film focused on the Bavarian state spa Bad Reichenhall and its tourist attractions.
One example was Miss Evelyn, the Bath Fairy, a young millionaire's daughter from the US who travels to Bad Reichenhall to recuperate. And all the war and inflation-damaged ex-aristocrats or young men are hot on her trail and want to conquer her. The whole film is set in Bad Reichenhall and showed in this way all the attractions of this modern health resort. The purpose was to lure people there, to show them this beautiful place, so that they'd travel there. Evelyn, the Bathing Fairy, was the first advertising film to be made as a feature film, 70 minutes, and it ran in cinemas throughout the Reich.
The fact that the population was growing steadily in big cities like Berlin meant new transport concepts were needed.
For the first time in 20 years, the railroads were exposed to noticeable competition. That was the truck, especially in freight transport. But the automobile also appeared, both individual and in the form of buses.
In the 1920s, traffic density also increased in the major cities. Due to the expansion of public passenger and bus transport, the revenues of the state railroad declined. The private motor vehicle industry threatened the railroad's monopoly on transportation.
The National Railway had to react. It had to get to the customer. It had to learn to assert itself. Before, as a clear monopolist, this was not necessary at all. And so the Reichsbahn began to take a closer look at certain segments of the market, to advertise and serve them, or to use these new means of transportation itself. It had built up its own fleet of vehicles, for example, with a view to the tourist, the excursionist, the traveller, and had also created its own bus network.
Regular bus services developed, primarily under the leadership of the National Postal Service. The entire German route network had increased to 56,000 kilometers by the end of the 20s. In response, the National Railway expanded its range of special fares and shortened the journey time on certain routes, the aim being to attract more passengers again.
The development of large cities and conurbations in the course of industrialization were also factors where the railroad played a very large role. First of all, classically with the suburban trains, which means that when settlements were built somewhere, people had to get to work and couldn't always walk for 2 hours. And so settlements were often built, especially worker settlements along the railway line. Or rather, where a settlement was built, rail lines were then also planned and built.
For most working families, it often remained a day trip or a short trip to the outskirts of the cities, despite the entitlement of vacation under the collective bargaining agreement. Especially on Sunday excursions, those seeking recreation used the local rail service.
These urban and suburban railroads also had an important recreational function for city dwellers. They were not only a feeder to the workplace and the bringer home in the evening, but with these trains, city and conurbation dwellers could also get to the countryside. This was already being offered in the 19th century, including by the railroad itself, as a form of recreation, encouraging city dwellers to spend their Sunday leisure time in the country.
Along the railroad lines used for excursions, a variety of tourist packages were being created. Tourism was becoming a serious economic factor. The most spectacular travel offer was a luxury train. From 1928, the Rheingold ran between the Netherlands and Switzerland. The German National Railroad thus entered the international competition for wealthy customers.
The Rheingold was a connection from the Hook of Holland along the Rhine to Switzerland and operated, in fact, primarily as a tourist route, especially for well-heeled foreign travellers. With the Rheingold, the National Railway developed a luxury train, offering only first and second class cars, all individually equipped and with unparalleled comfort. This was a train of which one can say that it really appealed to the travellers, the tourist travellers, to a high degree. There was also the odd businessman sitting in it.
On the approximately 670-kilometer route, the up to 130 passengers could enjoy a special service. The luxuriously equipped train offered unprecedented travel comfort.
For contrast, one can look at things like the flying hamburger, the modern diesel tripper train, developed as part of the development of an urban transport network at the beginning of the 30s. There one sees rather the business traveller. This train was not ostensibly a tourist train and marked an important development. In the long run, this urban rapid transit train prevailed, while the luxury trains, such as the Rheingold, more or less disappeared. There are only a few exceptions today. From that point, rapid transit took over and continued.
The National Socialists became the strongest force in the Weimar Republic. At the end of January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as Reich Chancellor. After coming to power, the Nazi regime wasted no time in bringing society into line. Parties and trade unions were smashed. Even the National Railway was made to serve as a tool of the National Socialist dictatorship.
The
Reichsbahn under the Third Reich was more or less nationalized again. The company itself, which still had a lot of private sector traits to it, was dissolved and became a purely state-owned enterprise once more, and one of the first major National Socialist model companies. That is to say, it was brought into line pretty quickly and without any problems, as there was actually no significant resistance to this process within the Reichsbahn itself. The network was, of course, of great importance to National Socialism, both from a propaganda point of view as a means of transportation for mass events, the Reich Party rallies, for example, but also as a logistical instrument in the course of war preparations.
After just a few weeks, Adolf Hitler commissioned the general director of the Reichsbahn, Julius Dorpmüller, to immediately build a highway network. In September 1933, the Führer had himself filmed for propaganda purpose at the symbolic groundbreaking ceremony.
This project, the construction of the national motorway system, served on the one hand as a job creation measure, on the other hand for propaganda purposes, as well as having strategic orientations. It was a project that the Nazis didn't invent. The first motorways had already been developed in the 1920s, including the idea of national employment through building motorways. In that respect, it wasn't new. But in the form and to the extent that it was, the Nazis then pushed it forward, and they again made use of the National Railway.
2 years after the start of construction, Hitler was able to open a section of the new highway near Frankfurt. But the idea of an expressway was not an invention of the National Socialists. Plans for it had already begun in the Weimar Republic.
If you look back at it from today's perspective, the Reichsbahn laid the foundation for its own competition in the 1930s. It had to build the motorway system. It didn't do it voluntarily, and it didn't do it for economic reasons. But it started to build these highways, which then became, as it were, the basis for its own competition later on, through, of course, individual automobile traffic.
Another field of activity of the National Socialists was the leisure activities of the Volksgemeinschaft. For this purpose, they founded the Nazi organization Strength Through Joy under the leadership of Robert Ley. Hasso Spode researched their history in the Historical Archive of Tourism in Berlin.
They very quickly realized that travel and vacation was a bourgeois privilege that the working class didn't have a part in. That travel and vacation were a great way to endear themselves to the working class. So they said, well, let's build a giant travel organization. And they gave this travel organization the pithy name Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy.
The main task was to organize weekend excursions and vacation trips. The so-called KDF Kurztouren, mini-tours, quickly became a big success.
Kraft durch Freude wurde innerhalb von Wochen der größte.
Strength Through Joy became the largest tour operator in the world within weeks. It is unbelievable with what organizational skill mass tourism was organized there for the first time on a huge scale. At some point, millions of people went on vacation with KDF, as it was abbreviated. According to my calculations, there were 45 million by World War II, although that includes excursions, as not all of them went on real vacations. But it's a remarkable number and a fantastic logistical achievement.
This was also the case with the KDF Bad der 20.000 in Prora. Up to 20,000 people were supposed to holiday in the 5-kilometer-long Colossus of Rügen, all at the same time. The preserved building complex was built in just under 3 years.
Was die anderen versprachen, hat der Führer erfüllt. Gab Arbeit, gab wieder Freude am Leben. Ein gewaltiges Werk wurde aufgebaut. Reisen ins schöne Deutschland, an die See, ins Gebirge, an den Rhein, in den Hafen, bringen uns Erholung und Gesundheit. Trabt euch beide!
Since 1934, the special trains had been rolling through the German Reich to send up to 10,000 worker holidaymakers on vacation.
The organization Strength Through Joy was initially intended to replace the sports and leisure activities of the forbidden workers' clubs. But quite early on, it also took up the case of travel and excursions. KDF is ultimately still known today, actually as a large tour operator. They took over services offered by travel agencies, provided many of their own offers, and this was extremely exploited for propaganda purposes. And the National Railway, the Reichsbahn, played a major role in this provision, because ultimately it was still the means of transportation par excellence in the 30s.
At the same time, the Nazi leadership's propaganda made it clear that the railroad was entirely at the service of the state. The construction of the city of the KDF car near Fallersleben, later Wolfsburg, was another prestige project of the Nazi regime. An automobile affordable for everyone was to be built there.
Der Massentourismus war nicht.
Mass tourism was not the only field of activity in which the Nazis tried to produce mass consumption, and they did so via mass production. That was not at all self-evident at that time, but through it things became cheaper, and that's how KDF actually worked. Big turnover, low prices. And they also tried this in other consumer areas, but failed. The most famous is, of course, the Volkswagen, which was called KDF Wagen for a while. But the idea was exactly the same. Cheap mass production so that the people could drive cars.
But contrary to what this Nazi propaganda film suggests, mass production of the KDF car didn't take place. Like the construction of the Autobahn, the vision of mobility for the people remained in its infancy. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of the Second World War. 6 years later, the Nazi dictatorship had fallen and the German Reich lay in ruins.
The German Reichsbahn suffered considerable destruction during the Second World War, but it was not the case that rail traffic came to a standstill in 1945. So, if you take a closer look at this famous phrase of 0 hour, it meant that while there were no fixed points in time, there were always different parts of Germany where traffic was then at a standstill, or where reconstruction was already underway.
From the destroyed German cities at that time, countless homeless people were on the move. They presented the Reichsbahn with a major transportation problem.
Of course, there were also a lot of people on the road. These were the displaced, and also people returning home. There were quite a lot of them. Also people, especially from the cities, who went to the countryside to forage, to exchange food with the farmers. People hung on the outside of the trains, they sat on roofs, they squatted on couplings. Many died in the process. One shouldn't close one's eyes to this. There were often accidents and the like. The trains were full.
Because of the food shortage in the cities, the population went on hoarding trips to the surrounding areas. As early as 1946, the Nord Express was once again running between Paris and Copenhagen. Via the Kiel Canal and the Rendsburg High Bridge, the route also led to Hamburg, where the traces of the war were still unmistakable.
Wir sehen nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg,
we see after the Second World War how seriously tourism was taken.
Das Recht auf Urlaub wird
The right to vacation was written into the Human Rights Charter, part of UN thinking, as if they didn't have enough to worry about right after the war. Access to clean drinking water, in fact, was only added to the Human Rights Charter in 2010.
At the beginning of the 1950s, many Germans were drawn from the devastated cities to the unspoiled mountain world of Bavaria. The young Federal Republic guaranteed its citizens a minimum vacation of 12 working days. Even then, a visit to the Zugspitze was a tourist must for every holidaymaker.
The economy was starting up again, there was work again, things were being built up due to many factors, including currency reform, and that also made it possible to go out again, to go on vacation.
Even during the Third Reich, tourism pioneer Karl Degener had organized package tours to Ruhpolding in Bavaria. Thanks to his idea, the resort remained the most popular tourist destination in Germany even after the war.
Towards the end of the Weimar Republic, Karl Degener tried to establish a travel agency which would enable even large sections of society, even those not financially strong, to have a holiday, and in this context developed railroad package tourism.
Tour operator Degener also promoted cheap vacations to Bavaria in the Berlin capital, which ensured the rise of Ruhpolding as the German vacation resort.
After the Second World War, Karl Degener took up this idea again and continued to offer package tours by rail, which also developed very strongly in the 1950s. This was under the name Touropa, a travel agency he joined, which he then also managed and developed for many years as managing director. And this Touropa specialized to a large extent in collaborations with the railroad, which really had a massive impact.
1960. The image of the ideal mountain world was scratched for the first time. A filmmaker documented mass tourism in Ruhpolding. The leading tour operator, Karl Degener, reacted to this and took legal action. In the end, he even bought the film.
Nun, so fängt an, der Urlaub von der Stange. Auch wenn es für manche ein Urlaub nach Maß zu werden verspricht. Erfüllt sich hier wirklich die Sehnsucht des Erholungssuchenden? Abseits von Verkehrstrubel, Autos, Lärm und Menschenmassen. Ist das der Friede des stillen, verträumten Bergdorfes? Oder wird dieser Trubel gar bewusst veranstaltet, um den an Unrast gewohnten Großstädter hier leichter heimisch zu machen?
Ruhpolding war das Mallorca der 50er Jahre.
Ruhpolding was the Mallorca of the 1950s. They called it Remi Demi in the beer tents. There was a surplus of women, which the village youth of Ruhpolding used to hook up with. And all that, just imagine, in the prudish Adenauer era. That was scandalous. Ruhpolding was the symbol of mass tourism, which today, if you like, is one of those large party areas on Mallorca, such as Ballermann.
Altbewährte derbe Späßchen leiten die Ortsbesichtigung ein. Das Sehenswürdigste, oder besser gesagt, das Bemerkenswerteste an diesem Rundgang ist allerdings der Rundgang selbst. Erspart er doch dem Einzelnen das Wagnis einer eigenen Entdeckungsreise durch den kleinen Ort. Vielen dient die sogenannte Ferienentspannung, die von Ärzten immer dringender gefordert wird, doch nur dem Ziel, die innere Leere und das Unerfülltsein im Alltag bei lärmender Ablenkung zu vergessen.
In July 1953, the 500,000th VW Beetle rolled off the production line at Volkswagen in Wolfsburg. Small cars were mass-produced, making them affordable for ordinary people. At the beginning of the 50s, just as many cars were again driving through the Federal Republic as before the start of the war. At the same time, a wave of travel began and West Germans conquered a new holiday destination in Italy. Thanks to the economic miracle and rising wages, many could now travel to Bella Italia, their dream destination and dream land, in their own car. As early as 1957, an estimated 4 million Germans spent their vacations south of the Alps.
In West Germany, people actually had more of an aversion to package tours and mass tourism. That had to do with the experience of strength through joy on the one hand, but also with developments in East Germany on the other. One wanted to set oneself apart from that. So, in the 50s and 60s, we experienced a boom in individual travel. People traveled individually, by car. Germany was also called Autoland, the land of the car.
Deutschland Autoland hieß es.
A suitable vehicle for individual travelers was the Zündapp Janus. Tourist vagabonds in particular were attracted by the unusual design. The Janus was suitable for beach camping and remained a particularly affordable alternative to organized travel for many Germans.
Man hat sehr viel getan.
A great deal was done to advance individual motorization. And what was the car used for? Mainly for excursions while on holiday. Just like today, by the way. It's the main vehicle for getting around on excursions. So we have this individual motorization, which then leads into individual tourism.
Die dann in den Individualtourismus führt.
By the end of the 1950s, 1/3 of Germans were already taking vacation trips by car. The travel service also included customized route planners and special car guides.
Diese Autoführer in den 50ern.
These car guides of the 50s were still quite successful well into the 60s. Meticulous route descriptions from kilometer 15.8 to kilometer 16.3, left here, right there. That was one half of the car guide. The other half was the description of the cities from A to Z, which were located along those routes.
Germany's desire to travel was spurred on by the abolition of visa restrictions. The hard currency, the Deutschmark, had high purchasing power abroad.
Der bekannte Kurort Westerland auf der Nordseeinsel Sylt bekommt allmählich wieder sein altes Friedensaussehen. Sommer und See, Erholung und Gesundung in Westerland kommen in dieser Saison hauptsächlich Kranken und Erholungsbedürftigen zugute. Im Kinderheim Dr. Ross genießen Arbeiterkinder 6 Wochen lang das Strandleben. Die ersten Strandgäste aber nützen die so lange ersehnte Gelegenheit, wieder ein richtiges Badeleben führen zu können. Mit Strandkorb-Idyll und Zweisamkeit. Nach alter Westerländer Sitte.
From the beginning of the 50s to the second half of the 50s, the numbers of those traveling again increased tenfold. And there, of course, such destinations as Sylt were also of very special importance. For one thing, they were already established. They offered good access. And, as is always the case, whoever has the most money was also the first to travel again. And it was certainly the more well-heeled tourists who were then drawn back to such sophisticated places as Sylt at an early stage.
The Kappmeier family from Bad Oeynhausen, 1957, also spent their holiday on the North Sea island. A beach holiday was right at the top of the popularity scale of holiday wishes in the economic miracle country. Starting in the 1950s, the German Federal Railroad participated in the newly founded European TEE network with its own express train. First-class equipment and fine catering quickly made the Trans-Europe Express an ambassador on rails. The TEE network consolidated the integration of the still young Federal Republic into a Western Europe without borders.
In the GDR, the process was a bit different. With regard to travel, this was also due to the fact that the majority of holiday trips were handled or offered by the companies and the Free German Trade Union Federation. And these trips were often offered in conjunction with train tickets. This in turn meant that many people also went on holiday by train. On the one hand, to spare the car, and on the other hand, the purse. Because these train journeys, just like the holidays offered locally, were highly subsidized. The GDR spent 5% of the state budget to finance the holidays of its citizens. And as a result, such holiday trips by railroad were quite cheap.
From the mid-1960s, the arrival of the Trabant enabled mass motorization in the GDR, which then also became a car country. The two-stroke car, affectionately known as the Trabi or Rennpappe, was produced until 1990.
In the beginning, most people traveled with the FDGB, with the state agency, so to speak. And gradually, after a 10-year delay, we also got individual motorization. Now it's not the Beetle, but the Trabi. But the development was similarly time-delayed, and then also used to make trips and journeys. And so, slowly, individual tourism was increasing.
der Individualtourismus zu.
The special highlight of GDR camping was a permanently mounted tent on the roof of the Trabi, affectionately known as boarding house Sachsenruh. However, the quick assembly of the roof tent was offset by a waiting period for this cult object of 3.5 years. It cost 2,036 GDR marks at the time. Since the 1970s, a new trend had been emerging in Western Germany. The demand was no longer for all-inclusive bathing fun, but for a special experience. The guests of the Rolling Hotel, Rotel for short, couldn't expect comfort.
Es ist dies keine Reise für Leute, die Jahr für Jahr an denselben Urlaubsort fahren, doch ja keine Risiken einzugehen. Wer aber glaubt, auf jeglichen Komfort verzichten zu können, hart im Nehmen ist und für relativ wenig Geld viele Eindrücke sammeln möchte. Bitte schön, Rotel-Tours macht's möglich.
The Rolling Hotel was an intercity bus in the front and a trailer with 39 sleeping cabins in the back.
Wenn das Gespann für die Nacht geparkt ist, wird eine Längswand des Hängers zur Seite ausgeklappt. So entsteht ein 2 Meter breiter und über 8 Meter langer Gang, von dem aus die 39 Schlafkabinen erreichbar sind. Die Waben sind etwa 75 Zentimeter breit, ebenso hoch, 1,85 lang und müssen auf allen Vieren bekrochen werden.
However, even the convinced alternative traveler didn't want to do without a certain level of comfort. Otherwise, the Hotel Tours holidaymaker bore the sometimes deprivation-filled desert tour with composure.
Morgentoilette in der Sahara. Es ist schon so, der Mensch gewöhnt sich an manches. Nach wochenlangen Strapazen und Entbehrungen nimmt er eine fatalistische Haltung ein und wird gelassen. Und mancher wundert sich, wie anspruchslos er doch geworden ist.
Rotel Tours was a pioneer in German post-war tourism and still offers individual tours worldwide, far off the beaten tourist track.
Interessant ist aber ein Gleichklang in der
What is interesting, however, is a consonance in the intensity of travel, that is, in the proportion of people who actually go on holiday. The trend is very similar. In the beginning, the Federal Republic led. Around 1970, the GDR caught up with West Germany. And then, at the end of the GDR, the East Germans were the travel world champions. They had the highest travel intensity in the world.
It was precisely the severely restricted freedom of travel in the GDR that led in 1989 to the fall of the wall. Travel behavior in West and East Germany largely converged after reunification. The prospects for tourism were good. A new trend was developing, leading away from the classic summer vacation.
Wir reisen immer kürzer, aber immer öfter.
We were travelling for shorter and shorter periods, but more and more often. And this development has accelerated again, especially since the turn of the millennium. And so we were in a trend until 2019 where we were travelling more and more, but shorter and shorter. That's good recreationally, by the way. The change of scenery makes you feel kind of relaxed. You come home and then it always takes a week, 2 at the most, to get back to how you were before. So the status quo ante is always the same, whether I'm away for 6 weeks or just 1 week. And we had that trend.
At the beginning of 2020, the COVID pandemic reached Europe, bringing public life to a standstill. Politicians resorted to drastic measures to slow down the spread of the virus. National borders were closed and the transport infrastructure largely came to a standstill. Strict hygiene measures determined everyday life.
If you look at the present, the pandemic, corona, the social impact and also the impact on the railroads, you find out first of all that the railroad still ran, still maintained service, even though a good 90% of the passengers were missing. And that's certainly a factor when you look at the railroad and you see that the system was able to carry on and that it's still there as the backbone in our society in terms of mobility. And it will be interesting to see what kind of response there will be, how people's travel behavior will change and what opportunities there might be for the railroads. The future will show whether it can regain its popularity, especially among tourists.
Strict restrictions caused the international travel market to collapse. The economic consequences of the COVID pandemic were not foreseeable for the industry.
Because the other side of the coin was what actually happens to the tourism industry, which has been booming up to now. I don't think that's been said at all yet. And it hasn't been said at all that in the long term we will slide into a very, very bad economic crisis. And this economic crisis will, again because of the virus, first of all hit the event industries the most. And the biggest event industry in that respect is tourism, and it will suffer for a long, long time.
Without billions of euros in government support, even Deutsche Bahn cannot maintain its normal operations. Travel by land, nevertheless, remains crisis-proof.